What about breakfast? We've already had it. We've had one. Yes. What about second breakfast? But what about our morning meal? Surely a quick bite wouldn't delay us much. Strider's brow furrowed in confusion. You broke your fast barely an hour ago. Well, yes, Pippin replied, as if explaining something painfully obvious. That was first breakfast. What about second breakfast? This classic exchange is one of the most quoted comedic moments in both Peter Jackson's film adaptation of The Fellowship of the Ring and Ian Chesterfield's novelization, and provides us with a light-hearted comparison of how film and prose approach humor, pacing, and character expression. The film version condenses the joke into a rapid-fire 3-line exchange. It's funny because of its pace, delivery, and the juxtaposition of serious context with Pippin's very Hobbit-like concern about food. The novelization draws the same laugh, but it earns it differently by adding a bit of internal dialogue and description. This exchange is iconic because it captures so much about the Hobbit's nature and about how tone, pacing, and delivery change depending on medium. To further explore these differences, this video will look at one part of the story in both the film and the novelization of The Fellowship of the Ring. First, we'll watch a short clip from the film. Then, we'll read the matching chapter from the novelization. Since films move quickly and can show a lot in just a few minutes, while novels often take pages to describe the same events, we'll break the novelization chapters into short passages. After each passage, we'll stop to talk about what works well in the novel, what might be stronger in the film, and how each version tells the story in its own way. We'll go back and forth like this until we've worked through the whole chapter. At the end, we'll wrap everything up by thinking about what each medium does best, where they might struggle, and how comparing them helps us understand the story in a new way. By the time we're finished, we'll have a much clearer idea of how storytelling changes when it moves from screen to page, and why that matters. Let's begin.
Where are you taking us? Into the wild. How do we know this Strider is a friend of Gandalf? We have no choice but to trust him. But where is he leading us? To Rivendell, Master Gamgee. To the House of Elrond. Did you hear that? Rivendell. We're going to see the elves. Gentlemen, we do not stop till nightfall. What about breakfast? We've already had it. We've had one, yes. What about second breakfast? Don't think he knows about second breakfast, Pip. What about 11's? Luncheon, afternoon tea, dinner, supper. He knows about them, doesn't he? I wouldn't count on it. Pippin! The power of Isengard is at your command, Sauron, Lord of the Earth. What orders for Mordor, my lord? What does the High command? We have work to do. The trees are strong, my lord. Their roots go deep. Rip them all down.
Next, we'll read the first passage from the chapter of the novelization, and then compare and analyze the differences. Dawn broke reluctantly over the Chetwood forest, casting weak shafts of light through the dense canopy. The air hung heavy with moisture, clinging to cloaks and hair as the small company made their way through the undergrowth. Strider led the way, his long strides forcing the hobbits to work twice as hard to keep pace. Behind Frodo, Merry and Pippin trudged along, their faces drawn with fatigue and worry. At the rear, Sam guided a scrawny, underfed pony they had hastily purchased in Bree before their departure. The animal, whom Sam had named Bill, carried their meagre supplies with a patient dignity that belied his rough appearance. "Where exactly are you taking us?" Frodo called ahead, pushing aside a low-hanging branch as he struggled to keep Strider in sight. "Away from roads and settlements," the ranger replied without slowing or turning. "Into places where those riders are reluctant to follow." The ranger's cryptic answers did little to ease the hobbit's concerns. When Strider disappeared momentarily around a thick stand of trees, Merry pulled closer to Frodo.
"How can we be certain this wanderer truly has connections to Gandalf?"
he whispered, glancing ahead nervously.
"He could be leading us anywhere."
Frodo's hand unconsciously moved to his chest, feeling the hard circle of metal beneath his shirt. "We have precious few options now," he admitted. "Faith in Strider is all we have." "But what destination does he have in mind?" Sam wondered aloud, his voice carrying further than intended. Ahead of them, Strider paused and glanced back, his keen hearing having caught the question. His gaze settled on Sam and the pony. "We journey to Rivendell," he announced, a hint of warmth softening his stern features. "To the House of Elrond." Sam's tired face transformed instantly, wonder replacing exhaustion in his eyes. "Rivendell!" he exclaimed, momentarily forgetting his aching feet. "Did you hear that, Mr. Frodo? We're going to see the elves!" Despite the danger that pursued them and the long road ahead, Sam's childlike enthusiasm brought a small smile to Frodo's face. In that brief moment, the burden he carried seemed just a little lighter. Strider turned away, hiding his own slight smile as he led them deeper into the shadowed forest, away from the roads where dark riders might easily follow.
This opening passage from this chapter of the novelization demonstrates many of the distinctive strengths that prose holds over film as a storytelling medium, while also illuminating certain limitations. In prose, the narrative is able to linger in small, quiet details. The weight of mist on cloaks and hair, the steady endurance of an animal, the shift of emotion across a character's face, that the scene in the film either rushed past or left to implication. The description of Bill the pony, quote, carrying their meagre supplies with a patient dignity that belayed his rough appearance, end quote, offers a nuanced emotional texture that the film camera clearly didn't have time to dwell on. Here, the prose gently ascribes personality and grace to an otherwise humble creature, and that intimacy is earned through language alone. Similarly, internal thought and subtle shifts in trust are deftly rendered. We're brought into Frodo's uncertainty, Merry's suspicion, Sam's innocent joy. Their dialogue is supplemented by interiority and gesture. Frodo touching the ring beneath his shirt, Merry's furtive glances that deepen the emotional stakes. In the film, such layers could only be signaled with camera work or actor expression, but prose allows these interior cues to be expressed directly, building the character's psychological landscapes with clarity. But prose is not without its disadvantages. Where the film conjured immediate and immersive world-building through sweeping visuals, prose must construct everything from the ground up, using language alone. The mist, the forest, the wariness of travel, all must be imagined by the reader from textual hints. That requires a slower, more focused attention, and not all readers may stay attuned to the nuances. Let's continue.
The vast expanse of the Midgewater moors stretched before them like a windswept ocean of tall grasses and treacherous bogs. Morning mist clung to the ground in patches, creating ghostly islands in a sea of green and brown. The journey had already taken its toll on the hobbits, their short legs working twice as hard to navigate the uneven terrain. Frodo noticed his companions falling behind, and turned to see Sam, Merry and Pippin dropping their knapsacks to the soggy ground. Their faces bore the unmistakable look of hobbits preparing for a meal. Before he could say anything, Strider's weathered face appeared beside him, the ranger's eyes narrowing with impatience.
"We cannot afford to linger,"
Strider said, his voice carrying enough authority to make even Frodo straighten his posture.
"Nightfall is our destination, not mid-morning."
Pippin looked up with genuine distress in his eyes.
"But what about our morning meal? Surely a quick bite wouldn't delay us much."
Strider's brow furrowed in confusion.
"You broke your fast barely an hour ago." "Well, yes,"
Pippin replied, as if explaining something painfully obvious.
"That was first breakfast. What about second breakfast?"
The ranger stared at the young hobbit with a mixture of disbelief and bewilderment, before turning away with a slight shake of his head, continuing his relentless pace forward. Merry leaned toward his cousin, patting him sympathetically on the shoulder. "I suspect our guide isn't familiar with proper hobbit dining customs," he whispered. "The ways of the big folk are strange indeed."
"You mean he doesn't know about second breakfast?"
Pippin's voice rose in genuine alarm.
"What about Elevenses? Luncheon, afternoon tea, dinner? Surely he must observe supper, at least."
Merry cast a glance at Strider's retreating form. "I wouldn't build your hopes too high." Frodo suppressed a smile as he watched the exchange. Even in their current peril, some aspects of hobbit nature remained unchanged. Without warning, an apple came sailing through the air, which Merry caught deftly with one hand. A second apple followed, striking Pippin squarely on the forehead, before tumbling into his eager hands. Somewhere ahead, hidden by the tall grasses, Strider continued forward without breaking stride or looking back.
"Come along, Pippin,"
Merry sighed, taking a hearty bite of his apple. "It seems this is lunch and breakfast combined." The skies opened shortly thereafter, drenching the travellers in a cold, persistent rain that seemed to penetrate their cloaks and find every gap in their clothing. The hobbits trudged onward with hunched shoulders and downcast eyes, their earlier concerns about meals forgotten in the misery of wet feet and sodden clothing.
"This second passage shows one of the novelization's greatest strengths, the ability to balance tonal shifts within a single stretch of narrative. In prose, the playful, character-driven humor of the second breakfast exchange coexists with the more sobering reality of exhaustion, weather, and physical discomfort. That contrast is arguably sharper on the page than it was on film, because here the shift is managed entirely through word choice and rhythm rather than sound effect, camera movement, or editing. The humor works because the narrator can linger on the beats of the interaction, the dry precision of Strider's confusion, Pippin's escalating list of hobbit meals, and the wry aside about, quote, the ways of the big folk, end quote. The film made the moment more immediate through facial expressions and comic timing, but prose can slow the exchange down just enough for the reader to savour the interplay of personalities. The tossed apples, for example, are not just a gag, but also a small wordless admission from Strider that he understands their needs, even if he doesn't indulge them fully. In the film, this happened in a fraction of a second, but in writing, it gains weight from the framing. The fact that Strider doesn't break stride or look back is part of his characterization, something the narration can quietly underline. That said, some of what prose does well here also reveals its constraints. The film rendered the Midgewater moors in a sweeping aerial shot, making the windswept ocean of grasses a visceral, overwhelming presence in seconds. On the page, the description, while evocative, relies entirely on the reader's imagination to match that visual scale. Likewise, the comedic beats of the breakfast conversation depend on the reader's own timing, whereas in the film, the actor's comic timing, facial expression, and tonal inflection might have landed the jokes slightly more sharply. Let's continue. In the fortress of Orthanc, far to the south, the wizard Saruman stood alone in his uppermost chamber. The circular room was dimly lit by a single brazier, casting long shadows across the black stone floor. At its centre rested an object shrouded in dark velvet. With reverential slowness, Saruman drew back the covering to reveal a perfect sphere of dark crystal, a palantir, one of the ancient seeing stones of Numenor. Its surface appeared to swirl with clouds of smoke and shadow, occasionally parting to reveal a lidless eye wreathed in flame. The white wizard placed his pale hands upon the smooth surface, his fingertips whitening with pressure as he leaned forward. When he spoke, his rich voice had taken on a new quality, a servile tone that would have shocked any who knew him as the proud head of the White Council. "The power of Isengard awaits your command," he whispered, his eyes reflecting the fiery glow from within the stone. "Sauron, Lord of the Earth, I pledge myself to your purpose." The stone pulsed with malevolent light as a response came, not in words that any mortal ear could comprehend, but in harsh, guttural sounds that slithered through the chamber like poisonous snakes. The black speech of Mordor filled the room, and within its cruel cadence, Sauron's voice emerged. "Build me an army worthy of Mordor." Later, seated upon his obsidian throne, Saruman received the chief of his orc servants, a particularly large and brutal specimen whose scarred face bore witness to countless battles. The creature approached with a mixture of fear and anticipation. "What service does Mordor require, my lord? What instructions does the Eye send?" The orc growled, yellow eyes fixed upon his master. A cold smile played across Saruman's thin lips. "Preparations for war," he replied simply. "We have much to accomplish." This passage works well because it condenses a lot of narrative function into a tight atmospheric package, establishing Saruman's location, his alliance with Sauron, the nature of their communication, and his first concrete step toward war. On the page, the opening description of Orthanc's chamber sets a tone that is both austere and menacing. The, quote, single brazier and long shadows are a deliberate contrast to the idea of a white wizard, hinting that Saruman's path has turned away from light towards secrecy and darkness. In prose, you can linger on the reverence with which he unveils the palantir, giving it almost a ritualistic weight before revealing its ominous power. The film could show it visually, but here the narration controls pacing, slowing the moment just enough to make the Palantir's unveiling feel like a transgression. The advantage prose has here is that it can directly convey Saruman's servility in voice, something the film could only suggest through performance, but could not explicitly state without altering the script. The line about a, quote, servile tone that would have shocked any who knew him, end quote, gives the reader privileged insight into the depth of his transformation, context that enriches the moment beyond what's visible. Where the passage risks weakness is in its reliance on somewhat conventional imagery. The, quote, obsidian throne, the cold smile, the scarred orc chief, end quote. These descriptors are evocative, but also lean heavily on familiar fantasy shorthand, and prose can sometimes expose cliché more starkly than film, where design and acting might breathe new life into archetypal figures. Similarly, the direct line, quote, "Build me an army worthy of Mordor," end quote, reads dramatically, but in writing it risks feeling a little too cleanly theatrical, since text doesn't have the cushioning of a booming voice or visual grandeur to sell it. Let's continue.
High above the rapidly transforming grounds of Isengard, Gandalf the Grey regained consciousness on the barren summit of Orthanc. Pain lanced through his aged body as he pushed himself to his knees, then staggered to his feet. The wind tore at his tattered robes and tangled beard as he tried to orient himself. A terrible sound drifted up from below, the unmistakable crack and tear of living wood under brutal assault. Gandalf rushed to the edge of the tower, peering down the dizzying 500-foot drop to the grounds below. What he saw wrenched a gasp of horror from his throat. The beautiful gardens of Isengard, cultivated over centuries by the wizards who had dwelled here, were being systematically destroyed. Orcs swarmed the grounds like insects, their axes flashing in the torchlight as they hacked at the ancient trees. One particularly massive oak, which had stood since before the tower itself was built, groaned as ropes and pulleys strained to tear it from the earth. Through the rain, Gandalf could make out Saruman's white-robed figure, directing the destruction. An orc overseer approached the wizard, wiping sweat and rain from his brutish face.
"The trees resist us," the creature reported, frustration evident in his harsh voice. "Their roots run deeper than we anticipated."
Saruman's response carried clearly through the night air, each word striking Gandalf like a physical blow.
"Destroy them all. Leave nothing standing."
Helpless tears mingled with raindrops on the grey wizard's face as he watched the wholesale destruction of beauty that could never be replaced. In that moment, he understood the full measure of Saruman's betrayal, not just of the Council, not just of the free peoples of Middle-earth, but of wisdom and stewardship itself.
This final passage takes a sharp tonal turn from the Saruman scene, shifting the point of view into Gandalf's experience, and it uses the written medium's strengths to deepen emotional impact in ways that the film handled differently. The opening moments are physical and immediate. Gandalf's pain, the tearing wind, the disorientation, grounding the reader in his body before broadening the scope to the transformation of Isengard. This movement from personal to panoramic is something prose can handle seamlessly without worrying about the visual logic of camera placement. The destruction itself benefits from the text's ability to mix literal detail with emotional interpretation. Quote, "Orcs swarmed the ground like insects," end quote, is a simile that invites the reader to feel revulsion, not just register the scale of the scene. The massive oak's groan, the flashing axes, and the pulleys tearing roots from the soil are described with deliberate pacing, giving each moment weight. In the film, these moments appeared in quick succession as a montage, but here they unfold at a speed that mirrors Gandalf's horrified attention. If there's a weakness, however, it's in the slightly heightened language around Gandalf's grief. Phrases like, quote, "wholesale destruction of beauty that could never be replaced," end quote, and "full measure of Saruman's betrayal," are earnest, but risk leaning toward the rhetorical. In the film, the sheer imagery of ancient trees falling communicated the same devastation with more subtlety. But in writing, there's a fine line between elevating a moment to mythic resonance and tipping into sentimentality. What prose ultimately offers is depth through slowness. It permits pauses, silent doubts, and small joys to share equal weight with grand declarations. The experience becomes not just about what happens, but how it feels from within. In contrast, film often excels in delivering scope, immediacy, and sensory immersion. Both mediums have their strengths, but in a chapter like this, the novelization makes the most of its own tools, intimacy, language, and inner reflection, to convey the peril and hope of the journey ahead. Thank you for watching this comparative analysis. Next time, we'll be comparing the scene in the film where Strider leads the hobbits to the ancient fortress on Weathertop Hill with the corresponding chapter in the novelization and analyzing the differences. Take care, and if you're listening to this, please send help.